Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, everyone. How are we? I know I'm kind of hiding to the back here. Good afternoon. How are we feeling? Good. All right. Well, welcome to a trip down memory lane, activism, culture, and the individual artist, as you can see on the screens. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Thank you. And to my left.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Salim Sagai, co-chair of New York Grantmakers in the Arts.
Great. We are so glad you joined us today. This is a collaborative event between Grantmakers in the Arts and New York GIA, and this space has been generously hosted by Philanthropy New York. So I'm going to kick it over to Angela right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Romualdez. I'm the Office and Conference Manager for Philanthropy New York. We're very thrilled to partner with New York Grantmakers in the Arts and Grantmakers in the Arts in hosting this program. Just a couple of notes. If you need Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi is for guests. The username is guest@fordfoundation.org. If anybody needs to use the restrooms, it's down this hallway past the elevators around the corner. And we'd like to thank our presenters today, and you have their bios in front of you, and I'll pass it back to Sherilyn.
Thank you, Angela. So to open the event, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the sacred land of the Lenape and Weppinger tribes. Are there any other Manhattan tribes that anyone would like to call out? Okay, well, we acknowledge elders in the past and present, and we are on sacred land.
So, of course, we're here today to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to all of us, support for individual artists. But we wanted to take a moment really quickly to acknowledge a tragic event that occurred last week in Chinatown. As many of you know, there was a fire at 70 Mulberry Street, which is a building that has very much a great deal of historical and cultural significance, including housing two linchpin Asian American cultural organizations, the H.T. Chen Dance Company, Chen Dance Center, and the archives of the Museum of Chinese in America. And so many of us, I think, have been in touch with these organizations, excuse me, independently, and there's also been a great deal of sort of back and forth on the NYGIA listserv to update all of our colleagues on what's happening as there are developments. So thank you all for contributing to that as well. It appears that the groups actually have been able to retrieve some items as of this morning, and the city also is stepping in to provide some temporary space and other resources as needed. I fully acknowledge that there's a long road ahead for both of these organizations, and so we invite you all to join us after today's panel discussion for an informal happy hour and also opportunity to engage in further discussion to see if there's anything that we can do collectively to support as these two organizations recover. Happy hour will be taking place at, sorry, forgot that part, Public House at 140 East 41st Street between 3rd and Lex. So I hope many of you can join.
Thank you. So at today's event, we are discussing how funders can better support individual artists in their work. When we initially started planning the event, the unforgettable culture wars of the late 80s and 90s came up in our conversation. And those are the cultural wars between artists and the National Endowment for the Arts. And so we got into an even deeper discussion around what is considered art, what is considered valuable, quotes, art, and how this translates into access for funding, both then and now. So we are glad to have, let me use the clicker here. Oh, am I not? Oh, no. Okay, well, oh, nope. Okay, not this slide, but it's fine. We are glad to have Susie Del Valle, President and Executive Director of Creative Capital, Miguel Luciano, visual artist, Lisa Jessie Peterson, playwright, Charles Rice Gonzalez, writer and co-founder of BAD, Bronx Academy of Arts and Dance, Dred Scott, visual artist, and moderating the discussion, we have Grantmakers in the Arts President and CEO, Eddie Torres. So this conversation discussion will be live on Facebook. And so don't worry, we're getting the backs of you, not the fronts of you, except for the presenters. We get the front of you. And if you are joining, hello, Facebook Live, you can feel free to enter your questions throughout the discussion, and we will address them to the presenters when it comes time to do so during the Q&A. And
So for those of you in the room, we have kind of a full house today, so we want to find a way to streamline some questions. We invite you to ask questions using your mobile device. There are some instructions at the center of the table to log into the Wi-Fi network here, and also use the code #artists, plural, to join the discussion there. So you can pose your questions, and then there's also a feature on Slido that allows you to use the thumbs up if you agree with the question that's already been asked and would like that, excuse me, to rise to the top during the Q&A.
all right, and on that note, let's begin.
All right, we got on to what you do, and I know you just had a big case before the Supreme Court, and
I think all cases before the Supreme Court are big.
Yes, they are. Once you get to the Supreme Court, you're playing the main room.
Yeah.
And they turned you down, but tell us why it is that if someone does art, no matter what it is, and the government refuses to fund it, why is that a violation of the First Amendment?
Well, the case was actually about the decency language clause that when giving out funds or giving out support by the federal government, that there has to be a certain standard of decency. And we felt that it was vague to decide who is going to decide what is decent or indecent. And second of all, indecent behavior or indecent language or indecent expression is covered by the First Amendment.
But not funded by it.
Yes, but see, you can't get away by funding or support as an American, wherever you go, whether it's at a library, anywhere.
This quest was submitted for the exhibition since it was one of the slides that had gotten me the award in the first place. And the American Family Association, when they found out about the award and the photograph, instigated this campaign where they sent out about 178,000 letters.
My hand got stuck really, really hard when certain fucked up right-wing senators and Congress people in Washington took my NEA grant away and took away the right of any queer person in America to raise their creative voice with 1 cent of our tax money. My hand got stuck really, really, really hard when so many of my lovers and friends died of AIDS.
With communism dead, Jesse Helms has found a new enemy to crusade against for this election. The controversial photographs of a dead homosexual artist.
I can't begin to describe those photos. Mr. Mapplethorpe, a self-portrait with a bullwhip protruding from his posterior.
I feel like this country was founded on biblical truths, and I feel like Helms is leading us more back that way.
Now that I have mourned the passing of men, loves never had, acts unacted, perversion polighted pubescently. Now that I have shed shades of nigger, boy, for pigments of faggot, queer, gender, blender, blur.
This election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side.
So, is this on?
No.
How about now? There we go. Fantastic. So thank you so much for being here with us. And so we're going to spend the next hour or so together just having a conversation with our artists and presenters. And then we're going to take your questions for about half an hour or so. And so this is obviously a really important conversation for all of us always, but particularly during the year of a federal election. And just to create context for, for this moment, while all of this was happening, in the midst of all of this, in 1990, there was a national poll taken. And what it found out was that 90% of Americans agreed with the following statement. Even if I find a particular piece of art objectionable, others have the right to view it. It was about 70%. That's the vast majority, well higher of 50%, that agreed that the federal government should support the arts. So I just want to put all of that and the halving of the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts in 1994, the elimination of grants for artists in 1994, within the context of those two data points, because this was not, even at the time, anybody who was aware of any of this knew this was not a reflection of the national will. This was a deliberate subversion of the national will. It was a very, very clever coming together of anti-tax advocates who just wanted to create a narrative of why taxes are bad, along with the religious right, who prior hadn't really come together in this way before. So with that context established, it was in 1994 when the NEA's budget was halved, when support for individual artists was eliminated, that I began working in the arts. I began working for the Bronx Council on the Arts, just my genius of good timing. And so I wanted to start by, as I've done, sort of placing the start of my work within the historical context and in dialogue with the idea of support for the arts and censorship. I wanted to ask you all to introduce yourselves and talk about your work and your beginning your career and the dialogue, the moment sort of when you began to realize, okay, I need support for my work, and on some level my work is controversial, and I am part of this dynamic now. Miguel, would you kick us off?
Sure. It's on? Yeah. So, yeah, really, this is the guy who should be talking about this more in terms of controversy. I don't know that my work has met the same level of controversy. When first time I realized I needed money for work was like, as soon as I got out of school. While I was in school, I came to New York straight out of grad school, and I got a NYFA grant, I think, within the first year or so, and I thought that was amazing, for painting. I was painting at that time. And that, I didn't realize how hard those were to get. And, $7,000 went a long way for me at that moment. It doesn't go as far today as it did then. It didn't go that far then, but that was a big deal. For me at that moment. And looking back, I think about how we measure the impact of funding that we can think of as large or small, depending on where we're at. But it's something that I still think about today in terms of how, when we're applying for grants, where that money's going to, how much is going to go to a project, how much is going to go to paying for your life, to sustain the work that you're doing, which is, I hope, a conversation we get into.
Yes.
In terms of the work meeting more controversy or finding bigger challenges, I think that was, I didn't expect to get funded for the more difficult ideas for a long time. I just didn't even have that expectation. And something shifted for me a few years ago, recently, like in 2017, when I was at Brick. I had my first solo show in a big space like that in New York. They commissioned the work, and 2017 was a big year. It was the 100-year anniversary of citizenship for Puerto Ricans in this country. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, and so it was a big year of controversy of in that regard in terms of looking back on that relationship. And the whole show was about the relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. It was also the year that the hurricane hit. It was the year that Oscar Lopez Rivera was freed, a Puerto Rican political prisoner who spent 35 years in prison. So it was a lot of things happening that year. And that year, I got support from the Cerna Foundation, got from Thriving Cultures. And that was the moment for me that was the game changer. That shifted everything. And it was, at the time, supporting a project about Puerto Rico when Puerto Rico wasn't officially part of the regions that they were supporting. And so how that worked and how we had to sort of strategically think about that was, and this is what made all the difference, was having one person who was an advocate for me, my work, and for those ideas and those connections, who was at CERN at that moment, who's no longer there. But it was a really important moment. And that's where things started to shift, you know.
So I want to ask you, Dred, could you talk about, do you mind if we pull up your work?
Yeah, please pull up the still image, I guess, probably what is the proper way. That's not my work. That's Miguel's work. It's great work. That's also Miguel's work. That's my work, yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, you asked about sort of our beginning of careers and culture wars. This is a project called What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag? And it was a work I made in 1988, and it became the center of controversy, national controversy, in 1989, when I was still an undergraduate at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it got to the point where, I mean, it's an installation for audience participation, and as you might be able to see, there's a photo montage on the wall, and the photo montage had the words, "What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag?" combined with images of South Korean students burning American flags, holding signs that said, "Yankee, go home, son of a bitch," and below that was flag-draped coffins coming back from Vietnam in a troop transport. There were books that were on a shelf that people could write responses to the question that was the title of the work, and there was a 3x5 foot flag that people had the option of standing on. And the controversy, I mean, it was part of a student show, an undergraduate student show, but there were demonstrations that called for the closing of the school. There were bomb threats that were flown into the school, and it got to the point where, after lots of complicated twists and turns, George Herbert Walker Bush, the President of the United States, called my work disgraceful, and then ultimately Congress outlawed it, which was about things that were bigger than just my work, but it actually very much said that that work, A, was very powerful, that this could matter, that the people that were powerful people were troubled by ideas like this and aesthetics like this getting to ordinary people, because the ordinary people included people from the housing projects and the ghettos and barrios that don't normally come to see conceptual artwork by undergraduate, unknown art students, and they were waiting in line for an hour to see it. And so it wasn't just my thoughts about what the flag was, but the fact that it resonated deeply with all sorts of people that got to the point where George Bush called it disgraceful, and Congress was trying to legislate against it and make it so that people couldn't see the work. And so, you know, that was a good way for me to get introduced to the world, because if the President of the United States didn't like what I was doing, I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. This is
And you have.
This is a good job. Yeah. But it did mean that there were, you know, challenges. And, you know, I got out of school, and, I mean, I was finishing up in 1989. Nobody thought of a career in the arts. I mean, that was not a career. It was something you did because you were too foolish to do anything else. But I knew that I wanted to make art, and I knew that to do that, that would need support. And I knew that that was going to be increasingly difficult, because right after this work became controversial, the names, you know, Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano and Karen Finley and Tim Miller, those became household words. And you know, and I was hearing that, you know, people wanted to include that work in a show of all these band artists' work, but my work was like, no, we can't actually include that. The Corcoran was going to do a show that included censored work, and they would not actually include mine. And so, you know, there was this thing of even within the realm of the band work, that mine was a little bit too outside the pale. And so I knew that, you know, getting it getting support, both financial support, but even, exhibition support was going to be difficult for the kind of work that I wanted to do. And so since this work, I've had a range of pieces that have been denounced by mayors, attacked in various ways, censored, threatened with censorship. And yet I've also managed to get funding. And I mean, you talked about the Cerna Foundation. I mean, they funded a recent project that just the whole arc of career. Could you play the two videos? They're really short, from a recent project called Slave Rebellion Reenactment. So these were, thank you. So these were scenes from Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which was a project that was a community engaged performance that happened this past November 8th and 9th on the outskirts of New Orleans and in the city itself, that had 350 people in period costumes with machetes and muskets and sickles and sabers, reenacting the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States, and sort of time traveling between the rebellion that happened in 1811 and the present now, set against oil refineries and gated communities and trailer parks and the city center itself. And so that project required a lot of funding, and Ford Foundation is one of the funders, and Cerna and Map Fund and Open Society was very generous, and there were many other funders that were part of it. A Blade of Grass, Socially Engaged Artist Fellowship. So it is possible for works, the kind of work that I do, which is challenging to get funding, but it is still a fight. And I think that that's really important to talk about, not just even so much me, but as Miguel's point, 20 years ago or more, maybe I got a $7,000 grant, which went a long way perhaps then, but now that doesn't do so much. And I just, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the New York Foundation for the Arts, which gave him that grant. I wasn't on it then, but I mean, it's a question that we
going to raise the amount of money.
Yeah, we please, we need to. So, but yeah, so I mean, but I think these questions of how do you get funding, controversial work, and the fact that without organizations like Creative Capital, which is in the room, and Susie here, no, I mean, so that was the first national grant I got in 2001, and so it was making what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag in 1988, and it being controversial in '89, and being part of the cultural wars where individual funding was removed from artists, which was not just the NEA, but it cut across everything, and Creative Capital stepped into the mix to say, no, we do need to support individual artists, and it was really important for me to get that grant when I got that, but there's still a question of there's a huge gap between the artists that need and the funding that's available.
So let me ask you, Lisa, could you talk about your work? Can you talk about sort of your introduction to all of this, your introduction to presenting your work, producing your work, and you're coming to realize, okay, I'm in dialogue with the need to finance my work and issues of what is and isn't financeable?
Sure. So I wrote a piece called "The Peculiar Patriot," which addresses mass incarceration, and I wrote it back in 2001. And I, like any artist, I wanted my work produced, in the theater. And my friends were getting produced, and their shows were going up at this theater and that theater. And so I was in that same milieu, and I said, great, my work is going to get produced too. And so I started submitting my work to different theaters, and it fell on deaf ears. And again, this is before Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. So mass incarceration was not even a word people were using. Prison industrial complex was not in the zeitgeist. And so here I am, a loudmouth, passionate Black woman, talking about a very taboo subject. And there was a theater artistic director, too, actually, who said, "Oh, we love your work, Lisa. Really strong, powerful voice." One said it was going to scare the subscribers, and the other one said that it was going to scare white people. And so I got really despondent, and I, didn't want to deal with traditional theater. And so I had a relationship at Rikers Island because I was a teaching artist there. And so I started doing my show at Rikers Island, and then I did my show at Eastern Correctional Facility, which is an upstate facility, maximum security for men, because I had a relationship with a teaching artist there who was bringing me in. And so that's where I leaned into the love, and the love was in prison, oddly enough. And I applied for NIFA, and I got that $7,000, which was like, back then, it was like the Willy Wonka ticket. I was like, oh my God, I've got all this money. And then I realized, oh, that's not a lot of money. And so I was able to self-fund a prison tour, and I wound up taking my play to over 35 prisons and penitentiaries across the country. And so I was performing, so I literally fell off the radar of traditional theater, and I was performing, but I was performing exclusively in correctional facilities. And I was still, as an artist, because I was working full time, I was able to, pay for my bus ticket and, my little lunch money when I was making these trips to these correctional facilities, and that $7,000, burns up really quick when you're trying to live and survive and, do these, just travel. And so I remember, for as an artist, for me, I couldn't figure out, I kept calling it the secret handshake. I was like, what is the secret handshake? There's got to be a secret handshake for access, for more funding, a secret handshake for theaters. There's got to be a secret handshake, and I couldn't figure out what the secret handshake was.
We're going to teach it to you in a couple minutes.
Oh, help me. Yes, I want that secret handshake. And so and then, writing grants, because even when I got the NIFA grant, grantees is a different language, and I didn't know what that language was. So I'm talking artese to people who want, grantees, and the two languages didn't connect. And so I didn't know that, because I'm just talking in my artistic way, but I didn't realize that there's certain buzzwords and things like that grant people want to hear or that excite them. And I didn't know that. I'm just talking about my art, in my creative artistic way. And so, again, my work was falling on deaf ears, and it wasn't getting support until I connected with MAP International, which no longer exists, but they were really fantastic organization. And they were able to translate the language of my art into grantees. And so that's when I started getting like little drips of support, and my work at that point, because now 10 years had passed, I'm still doing this work. Michelle Alexander's book came out, and so now it's in the zeitgeist. So now my work about mass incarceration and prison industrial complex is starting to pique some ears, and I'm starting to get some support. But it's still a struggle because it's I was in my work I talk about white supremacy, and I call white supremacy, and that's kind of a no. You don't call out the thing that is causing Black people pain and make white people feel bad. So I still get some pushback for that, and I'll talk about that later as we talk about the current stuff that I've done at Angola Penitentiary. But it wound up through MAP International kind of giving me that they were a conduit, an intermediary who knew how to speak that language and help secure some funding that elevated my work to another level where I was able to afford a dramaturg and have, space to rehearse and, all the things that other playwrights get when they're produced and they get that support from, the theaters. I had to do it on my own. I had to pay for my dramaturg. I had to pay for the rehearsal space. All of the stuff that normally playwrights get supported with. I had to kind of my career took the scenic route.
Well, I think it's really interesting. You're talking about your beginning by presenting your work in places where there was the infrastructure, which was prisons, And again, I opened with this statistic in terms of public support for the arts and public support even for the arts that were controversial, and it gives the lie to the line that this was a reflection of public will. But what you did also gives the lie to the idea that folks who were supporting cutting the arts were in support of smaller government or smaller public spending. The fact of the matter is, in those moments, the government tends to expand. What happens, though, what expands is things that wallop poor people. So prisons expanded exponentially. Law enforcement expanded exponentially. The military expanded exponentially. It was a time of great growth for the government. It just wasn't supporting any of you. Yeah, Charles, I wanted to ask you about your career arc. If you would talk to us about your entree into the arts and some of your first experiences.
Many, but I think you talked about the Bronx Council on the Arts, and that's a place that I went to as well. And what's interesting is that the Bronx Council on the Arts gives money to individual artists and still does. And it's one of the things. So right at the beginning, I understood that. But I guess one of the biggest things has been that I want to talk about is BAD. And so BAD began with an artist, right? Began with Arthur Aviles, right? And he was with Bill T. Jones's company for 8 years and traveled the world. And there were New York Times headlines with his name in it. But when he came back home to the Bronx and came back to New York City, he didn't really find that level of support. Luckily, he found me. And meaning... And I'm going to say that. There's qualify that, not just, but I'm wearing my name tag like, it's still on me like Brad Pitt at the Oscar thing, right? Everybody's going to wear their name tags now. But basically what he found was somebody, a partner that could help him, right? And so, and what he wanted to do, he learned, they're not opening those doors for me down in the downtown dance scene. I have to create another space in which to do my work, right? And the work that he wanted to do was work at that time that was super Latino, super queer, that included nudity. And so there was a lot of kind of like nice, yes, Arthur, nice, we love you. But there wasn't the invitations that were coming his way. So we began forming that in the Bronx. And then there was a warehouse that was next to us, and we said, can we go in there? And there's a deeper story to do that. But kind of like to think about, how do you go into this space? How do you create it? How do you support it and fund it? At the beginning, we had all kind of crazy deals because those deals are non-existent anymore. Nobody's going to give you free space, which we got for 2 years to be able to build something. But Arthur's, one of his first big pieces in the Bronx was a piece called Arturella. And it included nudity, and it included children, and it included community, and it was in the South Bronx. And so, we thought, a lot of people were thinking, oh, that would be easy to fund. All these things, you check off so many fucking boxes, you should be getting money. And that wasn't the case. And we think there's probably the queerness and the nudity were the things that were still, people were trying to digest and trying to understand. So, decades of lean years. We've been around for 21 years. It's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that there's been a turnaround in funding. And I think that's because the funding world is smarter and they're understanding things in a way and they're understanding what we're doing in a different kind of way. Now, one of the things that we do at BAD is that, it's the 3 artists that are here are super accomplished and they've done a lot of things, but you heard they all had a beginning, right? They all started somewhere. And so it's really important to be thinking about how do we support the artists in the spaces that are beginning, right? The ones that are experimenting with ideas, the ones that are looking for space, and give them resources and the facilities that they could create. Because as we heard, 7,000 goes so far, right? If there was a 0 added to that amount to these artists, they'd be doing different kinds of work, right? They'd be able to imagine their ideas in a different kind of way. So usually our struggle is that, right? I think if you go back to why Arthur found a partner and somebody that could help him, is because one of the ideas we had at the very beginning was that as a standalone dance company, it was way harder to support. Part of it is the trust that comes with the giving of money, right? The trust that you're going to do something valuable, and we'll get into that, with the giving of money. And so sometimes building an infrastructure to support an artist to do that is one way that we did it. But now we're all in the business of supporting many other artists who don't have that infrastructure, who are looking for individual support, who get a fee from us, but the fee we know is not enough for them to realize the work that they do. We find that those artists are super smart and intelligent because they don't only come to BAT, they're going to BACs, they're going to different places to put together and piece together the support that they need. But if they were not burdened with that piecing together, like what could they make? Like, what could they create with that? And so I think, and some of the things that we see, or some of the things that I see, not only in my space and other spaces, it's mind-blowing, right? Because I think we all know, I'm preaching to the choir, right? This is a room that we know that in the realm of art, right? That's where imagination is, that's where possibilities are created, that's where possibility is living and breathing, right? And I think the fear sometimes that we have with art is because art has the capacity to democratize ideas and bring it to different audiences in different places. So as we sit, and I said this before, in this time, in this country, where there is a civil war of ideas, I think, Eddie, you were talking about, there was a small group that was pushing this, but we know that somehow that group has expanded, right? And so here we are, talking about how do we support art? Because I think inside of art, in the work of individual artists, is where we're seeing that these ideas and the possibilities of a bigger, expansive America live, I think.
And Susie, let me ask you the same question. I mean, could you, one for the organization itself and also for yourself?
Well, I'm not an artist. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But I came to the work, I'm originally a trained banker. I came to the world of arts when I moved to New York about 22 years ago. And I came to the world of arts because of artists that I met on the islands, and that kind of inspired that interest, but it wasn't available to me. There was no arts education, so it took me to moving to New York to want to come into it. But I worked mostly in institutional aspects, American Composers Orchestra, while I was still in grad school, El Museo del Barrio for almost 11 and a half years. I had this really special opportunity of founding and developing the Sugar Hill Children's Museum of Art and Storytelling. But I have to say, coming to Creative Capital, it's where it brought my connection, my original interest of connecting with artists and being of service to artists to full play, right? And I imagine that I'm on this panel because Creative Capital was really founded as a result of the culture wars. And for full credit to Archibald Gillis, who was the then president of the Andy Warhol Foundation, and who quickly identified our founding director, Ruby Lerner, they really set out to say, if we are going to take over this role, since the NEA is no longer, there will be so much reduced funding for individual artists, what kind of role can we take up? And also think around new philanthropic models in doing so. So the Creative Capital was really this idea it was kind of inspired by several different things, but very much so by the venture capital model that was very popular at the time. So we don't just give you money. It isn't just a check. It is really, there's a long-term commitment that we take on. And besides the financial support, there's a lot of career advisory, coaching, gatherings. There's a whole setup in the way that we bring people together, a national network of support. And it's all about the networking to help you get the additional opportunities, the additional resources that you need. But it's really helping artists think, not just about, we really work with the artists through the life cycle of their project, but it goes beyond that, because it starts with that so that we understand what the ideas are that the artists are trying to develop. But ultimately, it's really about how do we help you think around long-term thriving practices. I would say we were founded as a result of the culture wars. Not that we seeked out controversy in work, but we were proud to support artists such as Dred Scott from the beginning. I loved it. 20 years later, I just had a family foundation call me, do you support artists working within the criminal justice system? I'm like, are you kidding? Come on, we've been doing that for 20 years, right? It wasn't that your work was controversial that we saw. We said this is an artist really thinking around impact, really thinking about the messaging that he wants to do, seriously committed to his practice, and likely not to get support elsewhere for this. So we should support him. We should support that voice that is important, to civil society. And there's several, like when you were talking, there's several examples that come to mind. Barbara Hammer was one of our first awardees, a very outward lesbian filmmaker who put big vaginas on the film. And people were like, oh, they were horrified, right? And it took her a long time to get the respect and due diligence, the regard for her brilliant work. But when I think about it, we also had Critical Art Ensemble, Steve Curtsy Barnes, who were really multidisciplinary artists, but really kind of very prominent within bio art, and creating all kinds of, they were working with, how do we call it? It wasn't aggressive E. coli at the time. It was kind of really this idea of that we had no idea or no control over the way that all of these bio aspects were being monitored or used. And right after September 11th, a neighbor ratted out on them, and the next thing you know, FBI was all over them, shut them down, and they were considered, national bioterrorists. How do you help artists like that then navigate to get back on their feet? We had to help them with legal services and things like that. But again, we didn't seek them out because of the controversy or what we considered controversial art, but we were really interested in the big, bold ideas of what artists wanted to put forward, and that would typically not get support elsewhere. And that's where we kind of set out our mission and continue to this day. What we consider what may have been controversial then to today. Today we support artists like Heather Dewey Hagborg, who's working with DNA. And her whole idea that there's no control or the way to monitor how people use our DNA. So she will take a strand and actually develop, and she will know everything about you except your name. What hair color, your eyes, your medical history, your what heritage you come from, et cetera, but just not your name. And that idea is a way of showing how little we know. But is that controversial today? I guess may be, and a lot of people may not consider that art. And to us, it is that creative artistic practice that leads to this research and storytelling. One of our more recent artists, Lauren McCarthy, 2019 awardee, is all about artificial intelligence and how we are not monitoring and understanding how technology is taking over our life. She, for one of her experiments, actually became the Alexa for a family. A family agreed to it, that she set up for 3 months and set up surveillance all over her, but she would respond and react. So you would say, Lauren, what's the weather like today? And she would respond. But more importantly, it got more and more that she started paying attention. She would have the coffee ready when they woke up. She would give them an alarm. The kids have to get to school. Don't forget this appointment. Don't forget to how far are we going to let technology? That was her kind of experiment. And the project that we've supported now, it started off that she was actually going to go to term as a surrogate mother. So she would help bring a child to life for a couple that could not do so on their own. She has since changed it. Talk about controversy. She has since changed it. That it will be more of an experiment, that she won't actually be bringing a child, but they will be reenacting as if she is. And in the ways that now this couple has total control of this person who's carrying their child. So it's leaning into some of the different kinds of ways that we live with. And it's just examples of what, in a certain way, activism, not activism, yeah.
No, that's really interesting because, I mean, you've spoken about the model, which is high touch, really follows an artist for years and is being responsive to their circumstances. And so I want to spin off from that. And some of you have already alluded to this, and it's kind of a dichotomous phenomenon of sort of self-determination versus I really had no choice. I needed to create my own thing. I needed to create my own space. I needed to create my own opportunities. I want to take a moment for you to talk about what are the challenges that are unique to being an artist and what you've done in terms of I just had to do this myself because I couldn't get funding for it. I couldn't get the infrastructure for it. Or on the other side, like, Arthur, your story was, we created an entire organization that was there to help artists because we recognized we didn't have those opportunities ourselves. So I want to spin off from that to talk about the challenges of being an artist, how you've addressed them, and then afterwards I want to talk about some of the models that have been proven particularly helpful for you.
I mean, the way I think about this question is that my whole approach to getting any funding from the beginning was just like that, all that money has to go to the project, right? And so how you made a living, what you did to create time to make that work was all kind of like sacrifice or secondary. And I didn't think about myself and those needs for a long time because I didn't think I was supposed to. I thought that the expectation was that you use all that money for material expenses and everything else is going to cost you to make the work, and you don't pay yourself anything. And nobody can, artists can't live that way. But I really felt like that was the expectation. And for me, it was a way to sort of leverage. I have an idea. I don't have the resources for it. So I am going to use all this money to produce that however I can. And leverage this project towards the next big project, right? At least in my mind, right? It didn't always work that way, but it takes so long. So we didn't talk about this, but how many grants we didn't get, all of us have applied for multiple grants multiple times, often before, achieving one. So it's a whole process, and that's why there's also kind of a pressure that when you do get the funding to make the most of it, right? And the thing that I think that we don't talk about much, especially not with funders, is about how artists are not sure how to pay themselves oftentimes, are not even, I think that we live in a culture where that has been sort of shunned or it's undervalued, right, as an expectation. And the unfortunate thing is that, then what is the expectation, right? That artists come from a place where they have resources just to do that work. It's like residencies too. I used to get mad at residencies because I'm like, who can afford to take a month off or 2 months off or even 2 weeks off from whatever your job is to go somewhere in the woods and make artwork, right? And I mean, that's a really valuable experience. I don't want to devalue that, but who can afford it? It's a particular constituency, right? The most privileged among those artist groups that can afford to do that, right? And so who can't do it are going to be the poorest, right? And disproportionately Black and brown people, who are not going to be represented in those spaces as much. So that applies to almost every other kind of art, space and relationship, to access money, opportunity, et cetera. So that's one thing I hope that we can talk about more openly is that I think that there's no conversation about how artists actually sustain themselves in the work that they make. And so what my practice later became as it's dry forever. And then all of a sudden you get 1 grant and then 2 grants and they come at the same time, right? And you then learn how to pay for the things that actually need to be paid for better because you have more resources. And that I've only had that happen once, right? And most of the time it's just you're moving money from here to there to try to make things work. And it's never clearly defined. And we have to sort of define it ourselves. And I think artists are notoriously uncomfortable doing that and having open conversations with funders too about like, it's great. I love that we got this money, but like in order to do this project, I need to work on it full time for 6 months, right? So I need to be able to take a leave from my job, or not teach that semester. Like I've done all this, by the way. And then I'm going to actually pay for my studio and pay, if you have to hire somebody or just pay your rent, like so you can do this project, right? And rarely is there money built into a grant that allows for or even imagines those necessities, right? And that's what's difficult about the process. As grateful as we always are to receive funding, one of the reasons that there's never enough is because the expenses of life and living and your studio practice are rarely factored in to those grants and how they're imagined.
And even if they are, they're kind of subsistence. I mean, I know, Miguel, I really appreciate and respect your work. You know that we're friends. Yeah. I also know that you got a day job. And I don't know for sure, but Eddie or Susie, you got a day job beyond your... No, it's like, no. So the people that are at the foundation, all you sitting right there, you are at your day job right now. You're at your day job. You probably all have health care. It might not be the best health care in the world, but you got health care. You got enough money to kind of live in New York without thinking, oh, I got to go get another job. Okay. I actually don't really have a day job, but every art project I do, it's all under...
This is part of the job, by the way.
Yeah, no, it is.
Like, these kinds of things are part of the work.
It is, but the thing is, so you talk about, well, okay, for up until 2017, you didn't figure out how to pay yourself. You were, like, figuring out some other way. And then 2017, it's, like, been kind of good. But I suspect, because I also know that you live... Your housing expense is actually below market.
So I live in a building at PS 109, which is affordable housing for artists. That also happened like in the last 5 years, which was also the game changer of my life in New York as an artist, period, is that I have an affordable rent in East Harlem, a neighborhood I always want to live in. That made a huge difference. One of my rents is affordable. I have a studio, but
the thing is, so that's great for you. But the what allows you, the individual Miguel, to do the badass work that you do is that your rent is basically subsidized in a certain sense. Okay, so where the rest of the art world is like, well, okay, well, Miguel's doing it on, like, we gave him like say $20,000 or whatever they gave you to do this project, and you were able to piece stuff together, but partially because your rent is low, and the rest of the art doesn't have that, and you still don't. I'm pretty sure have like great healthcare, and you still have a day job. And so it's the funding structures that we live within. The Slave Rebellion Reenactment Project, I couldn't have even dreamed of that project without the creative capital services that I got in 2001. But nonetheless, it was a project that I naively thought, I can get this done in 3 years. It took 6 years to do it, but my artist fee didn't double. It just stayed the same. So I'm the most poorly paid person on the whole project. And there are all these other things that it's like, I come out of the project, I'm actually, I didn't lose money, but I didn't make money. And I'm like, this is, this project that is deemed as one of the best projects of the decade by ArtNet. And it was, got two articles in the New York Times, 2 articles in the Guardian, features coming out in other publications. It's a really good project. It was deeply transformative for people. And yet, there wasn't enough generated in that project to be able to pay all my rent, studio rent, et cetera, et cetera. And so the model where we're kind of successful artists, it's like, yes, they're the Ai Weiweis is more, but we're okay. We've kind of turned a bit of a corner. Whereas, the artists that are just like working on their first not enough NIFA or something, those artists, the art world, y'all in a certain sense are making a bet that some of those guys will make it and some of them won't. We've kind of crossed that horizon, but nonetheless, it is still a barely subsistence model where we don't know if the next year we'll be able to do what we did, that all y'all are like, that project was great, man. That thing that Miguel did transformed East Harlem. That was incredible. Brought the young lords into the house. Oh yeah, you did. You were ahead of the curve. You did all this stuff before Michelle Alexander was talking about it. You've been talking about it. But then I suspect that, there's still a question of, well, do I got next year covered? Will I be able to do the next project? And then the thing of impact that you talk about, all of what we do, the second we do something successful, and the rest of the playing field that we're on, you have to do something kind of at that level. And that actually requires then a whole round of other funding. And for the Slave Rebellion Reenactment Project, I spent way more time than needed trying to raise money. I spent a lot of time trying to raise money, not making art, trying to raise money, because I didn't actually have an institutional partner that was capable of doing all of what needed to be done, because there's no way to fund this project. We did the impossible. We made a unicorn, which is great. But nonetheless, the models that are out there are actually sort of making artists spend, I mean, I know Miguel spends a lot of time raising money for some of your projects.
Well, yeah, both of us. I mean, obviously, but with this, these are also like, so we're successful relatively in the work that we do, but the work that we do is also like really kind of non-traditional still in our field. You know, neither of us have galleries that sustain our livelihoods. We teach part-time. We cobble together our resources doing artist talks and panels and all kinds of, I mean, see, that's the job. That's the full-time work. Teaching is the part-time work, right? And so but we're so used to it that, and you know, there's a lot of people like us doing this work. But the other model is even more rare, where you have artists who make work in the marketplace that has a different kind of financial life that supports them, right? And generally, it's just a different kind of work and emphasis. So I appreciate you bringing these things up. So we'll talk to this is another thing, like artists, this is kind of taboo, like artists don't talk to each other about these things that often. We're friends, so we talk about these things. And it's part of, I think, how we support each other in the work that we do, you know? We've been funded by a lot of the same people. But it's, in general, I think something that just needs broader conversation to be a healthier atmosphere.
I just want to jump in really quick. And, you know, you mentioned that we're, you know, relatively successful. This is actually just my third year that my art is supporting me. I've always supported my art, working full time, you know, to get what I thought was, you know, to get my art out there. So there was no support. I was supporting my art. I was working full time and using my money that I worked for to do my art. And so 2017 was the first time that I was able to not have to work a full-time job. And I didn't know that I didn't have to work a full-time job until my friend said, you know, you're okay right now. Like you can, because I had just did a book deal, and she said, you know, if you don't have to, because I was working at Rikers Island and getting up at 4:30 in the morning. It was crazy. And so she said, you don't have to work. And I said, and it didn't dawn on me that I didn't, because I've been doing it for over 15 years. And so to be in a position where my art is supporting me, is new and wild. And you know, when I applied for the Art for Justice Fund grant, and you know, talking about like undervaluing paying yourself, and so I didn't want to ask for too much because I wanted to get it, and I thought that, you know, if you ask for too much, you might not get it, and so I had put my own paying myself my fee to like something ridiculous, like $2,000 or something like that. And not only did we get the grant, but they said, you're not paying yourself enough. And I wept. I said, oh, because I didn't value myself enough, but they saw that I needed more support for my own fee to live. And even still, I don't have, you know, health care. So, I've got to figure that out. I'm figuring that out, you know, Medicaid, you know, and if I could get food stamps, I'll get food stamps too, because it's, I mean, it's just barely, you know, cutting the surface, and I'm still out here like a hamster on a wheel, like to make sure that, you know, I'm able to pay my rent and pay my bills. And, you know, I had to borrow money last week from a friend because, you know, you do a gig and it takes them, you know, 4 to 6 weeks to pay you. I'm like, don't do that to artists. Like, pay them after they leave the gig that day. Don't make me wait for my money. I have to call you. We can't afford that. So, I mean, it's still a struggle.
Sherilyn's got your checks right over there.
But I think, you know, hearing this conversation, I don't know, we'll hear during the Q&A, but I think sometimes is what I hear makes some folks nervous about funding artists, right? Because there's not a value placed on the day-to-day need of living, right? It's about like, I'm going to give you money, but it's to create that painting, to do that work, and to pay your artists and to pay your collaborators. But really looking at the whole scope of it, right now, like for instance, right now, I'm also on the board of NALAC, the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, and we were working with Pregones Theater. And right now, there was earthquakes in Puerto Rico. Pregones Theater has direct relationships with artists. They have these micrograms of $500. There's a FedEx package going out today, Wednesday, yes, is going to land there on Friday, and individual artists are going to get $500. $500 may not seem like a lot, but in those kind of situations, it's important. No strings attached. I don't care. Buy Pampers, buy whatever it is that you need to buy with it, because you need it. Because artists buy art supply, whatever it is that you need. And so the same thing when the hurricane happened, there was that. And so through NALAC, there is now also the Flamboyant is helping with that as well. But I think what I want to say about this, the point is that in terms of supporting artists, I think the other thing that we feel is that sometimes individual support comes, and when it comes, sometimes there's all these stipulations, right? And there's all these conditions, and you have to be able to do this, and you have to be able to do that, and we're going to give you X amount of money, and you have to do it in a year, and all that stuff. And so I think a lot of times, taking that into consideration when we're supporting artists, the big, larger swath of the art making and the day-to-day living, and also like, what is your project? Tell me what your project is. That, sometimes there's discovery in art, right? I could say, I'm a writer as well. I'm working on a novel. I have an idea, and sometimes in the process of creation, that's when I know when it is, and sometimes at a different point. So also when you're asking, what are you going to do? What is your project for? Sometimes these ideas are just the beginning. They're just the seeds of them. And that in the process, artists discover what they're going to do. So I'm thinking that as we're thinking, how do we support them? How do we give them, how do you make that ask of them? And how to be as even in the nonprofit world for organizations, how general operating is like challenging sometimes to get. But like the idea that artists, like general operating for artists, I guess, here's the money, you're going to figure it out, you're going to build your project, you're going to pay your rent and get your health insurance, whatever it is.
And Susie, I want to ask you too, but I mean, I want to make a point spinning off from that. Another thing that a lot of us talk about when we talk about either general operating support for organizations or support for artists is appetite for risk, right? As though these are really risky propositions. And, I do want to speak to, the revealing the lie of that. When it comes to appetite for risk, we generally, as a society here in the States, have an appetite for risk that we don't tend to talk about. So, I remember, again, I started in '94, and at the time there was this big sort of fetishy thing that nonprofits should start small business components, or that we should treat artists like entrepreneurs, et cetera. The failure rate for private businesses is like nearly 90%. I mean, the vast majority of private businesses will fail, right? And we don't talk about these like the private sector is some crazy idea, right? Talk about the expansion of the prison industrial complex. I mean, prisons, the average rate of recidivism for somebody coming out of prison is about 80%. If you said, hey, I want you to give me your tax money, I've got this idea, it succeeds about 20% of the time. You would say, that's insane. That's exactly what we do with prisons. We have a great appetite for risk when it comes to incarcerating people or investing in private businesses. We just don't talk about it that way. Susie.
On that note, so Creative Capital, we like to say we're not risk averse. And for us, it's not so much whether the project that you're applying for is feasible or what. It's more about the integrity and the validity of the idea. Is it worth pursuing? And that's where we support the artists on. And we're not even concerned whether you have the capacity or not. We're how do I call it, confident that we can work with you to get you there if you don't have the capacity, and how do we help you get there? And defining success the way you feel, that's, on your own terms, not on someone else's terms. how do you make sure you're always paying yourself and all of your collaborators, making sure you have the time. We do not, urge you to move very quickly. Sometimes, on average, we're now working between 2 to 5 years with artists on their projects, but it used to be really 3 to 8 years. We have had projects that have taken 10, 12 years to complete. And we have quite a few number of art projects that have not completed, and that was fine. We don't see those as failures. The reality is, to your point, when you are investing in some of these riskier projects, you understand that not all of them are going to complete. But what we have discovered, the way we work so closely, and I appreciate Dred, laying out some of those terms, but is that we do work with you and figure out what are the right tools that you need, what are the right connections that you need, what are the right resources that you need. Because we know that $50,000 in cash is really seed money. Because big projects not only take time, they take a lot of resources. And in particular, how do we then help you connect to other opportunities in the way that you manage that? Some of our resources are also the one-on-one coaching and advisory services, but talking about today's needs, we've had to include, some of it is financial planning and legal and all of that, but we've had to integrate that we are now offering mental health advisory services if that's what's needed. You can pay for child care if that's what's needed for you to get back into your practice, into your work. But one of the components I really want to point out, because I am fascinated sitting here, one, I want to point out that this is a full panel of all people of color, which I think is incredibly exciting, and also a way of where philanthropy has moved towards. But more importantly, that the artists are getting the voice. And I think that's really important, because a key component of creative capital is that we really build community. Dred is being modest because Dred got this grant in 2001, but he has continued beyond his project to remain connected. He is one of our main workshop facilitators. He's been an advisor to other artists, and the generosity of spirit. And we should not take that for granted, that a lot of artists, in the way that Miguel was talking about your relationships, I know that the support system starts here, and we very much encourage that and how you move forward. So also talking about risk, I think there is too little funding in trying to support those bigger ideas. I know what it took for you to take on this big project, for example, and I'm thrilled that quite a few people in this room actually finally supported the project, moved on, but I don't know if they really understood what it was that you took on. And I think the more, how these things change lives, these projects change lives, and more important, how they can change minds, which to me is the most important aspect of why you do the work and why we should be supporting the work. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but...
And we have a little bit of time left together before we go to questions, about 20, 30 minutes together. I just wanted to make sure that we took some time to talk about what you're working on coming up, in terms of, what you're producing, what your own appetite for risk is, and, the kinds of support that you're getting, that you're eager to get, etc.
Okay, can we put those images back on the screen? Okay, so let me see when this comes up. Yeah, it's okay. Okay, so this is a public art project that I did this past year about the activist history of the Young Lords in East Harlem. It was called Mapping Resistance, Young Lords in El Barrio. And working with Iran Maristani, who is the official photographer of the Young Lords. He was one of the founding members of the chapter here in New York. It was the 50-year anniversary, and we put up 10 of his images from 1969 that he took in East Harlem of different activist moments, and we mounted them at the same locations where the history took place, where those photos were taken. And then we did walking tours all summer long, really teaching that history forward to another generation, many of whom didn't know anything about it, but many of whom also knew little bits and pieces about it. And so this is one of those images of the Bronx March, one of the earliest marches of the Lords, who were actually marching in support of the Panthers in 1969. If you don't know who the Young Lords were, they were a radical group of mostly Puerto Rican activists for social justice, directly inspired by the Panthers. And they're like the Puerto Rican version of the Panthers, really. And so next slide. And then we had moments like this happen where the history came full circle. And this is Denise Oliver standing in front of she was the first woman in the central leadership of the Young Lords, standing in front of the photo that Hiram took of her, that's Hiram with her, 50 years ago in the same spot where the original office used to be, like on the same street. And so these were amazing kinds of moments. Next slide. think this is, yeah. And then, some of these images are still up. So this is at PS 109 in About His Art Space on 99th, 22nd, and 3rd. And this will be up for a while. The Bronx March image is still up on Lexington and 111th. And so the project is done, but these images remain as reminders of this legacy in our neighborhood. And I think one of the things that happened with this project is that, the culture caught up with this history, right? That we can look at this history in a very proud way today. But when they were activists 50 years ago, the community didn't always support who they were and what they were doing. They were radical. And so Hiram talked about that. Other members talked a lot about that in these tours, how, people got in trouble from going out to demonstrations. And so now there's a whole nother call to get back in the streets and to get back involved in issues that matter, many of the same issues that remain in crisis today that they were mobilizing around 50 years ago: health, food, education, housing. So anyway, the current work that I'm involved in sort of extends from some of this history. And I've been in a residency at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who became one of the sponsors and supporters of this project, Surdna Foundation, A Blade of Grass, and the Met. And it's a new residency that's kind of an experimental residency called the Civic Practice Partnership, and it's funded by the Keenan Foundation. And so I'm one of 2 inaugural residents with Rashida Bumbre, and there is a new cohort that's coming in this year. And what's unique about it is that it's not a residency where I'm at the Met and making work in a studio, responding to the collection. It's kind of set up in a really the opposite way, where it's about supporting artists who work in their own communities and thinking about how to leverage the resources of institutions in support of that work and how to actually build deeper connections with those communities in the process. So that's what I'm doing now. The residency, this is my 2nd year of the residency. It was just extended. And we have a big event happening June 6th, which is part of the 150-year anniversary of the Met celebration weekend. And there's kind of this parade project in process that I'll know more about soon and share, but there will be, I'm designing a component of that, and you can be sure that some of this history and that Puerto Rico will be present in that space.
Yeah, so the Slave Rebellion Reenactment Project just happened this past November, so there are various loose ends with that, including making sure that there's an archive that's created that's publicly accessible, and so I'm having to spend time to do that. And that's a weird thing. We didn't actually get the funding to have the infrastructure in place, and so now I'm like, okay, I guess I'm self-funding the creation of the archive. I'm not going to fund for the paying of it, but just the time to figure out the logistics. That's actually where it's like, well, we didn't get the funding, so I just got to put in the time myself. We're also, I'm collaborating with John Akamfra, who's an amazing filmmaker who does multi-channel films that are in galleries and museums. They're not, streamed on Netflix or showing in theaters typically. And so we're doing a film of Slave Rebellion reenactment where it uses that as a point of departure, which that's going to take some time. And that's also, we don't quite have all the funding for that, so we're still trying to figure that out. But largely, I'm hoping to get some time to figure out what's next, and I honestly don't know, and I really want to preserve the time to not just jump. I mean, there are other projects that I'm doing that are small that I'm really looking forward to doing, but I want to figure out what, both what this project was. It's the most important, significant, best project I've ever done, and I know that, and I'm happy about that, but I also don't fully understand what I did. And I also don't know what I want next, even beyond whether what I want is possible, but just I don't even know what I want. So I want to take time, and I don't know how I'm going to take time. So I actually don't know what's next, which is a good place to be, because for the past 6 years I've known exactly what's next. I've been really working on it, and it was a great project, and it worked out better than my wildest dreams. I knew it was going to be good, but it was like awesome, and I don't know. So I just got to take some time to figure that out.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you both sort of reflecting on this issue of documentation and reflecting on history and making sure that it's documented. Salem and I were talking a while back about this issue when it comes to small organizations and to generally work that has been done in communities that are underfinanced, and they're at such incredible risk of this work just not being ever documented, whether the work has physical artifacts or whether the work is ephemeral and has been filmed and has been recorded in some way. This is actually a real need in the field, which obviously you opened up with the fires in Chinatown. This really is revealing the vulnerability of a lot of communities right now.
I was just at a talk that Marilyn Nance did. Marilyn Nance documented Festac, which is this amazing gathering in Lagos in 1977. That was a Pan-African gathering, and it had Sun Ra, Stevie Wonder, Randy Weston, and all these amazing people. I think Maya Angelou might have been, but there was like people on the continent and the diaspora. And Marilyn Nance, who's now probably in her 70s, but she was a 23-year-old, kid when she went, and she was the primary photographer of it. And she basically said she had to, preserve this archive by herself because nobody was interested until now. And that is like, here's this amazing thing that I think 60,000 people came through Lagos to see this, and had all these amazing artists for a month that were there, and yet there wasn't the support or infrastructure until like 3 or 4 years ago to care for this pivotal event. And so, yes, we really do need funding. But I mean, I want to say one thing. I mean, that sort of we've talked about, but haven't talked about. We talked about the beginning of the culture wars. And that's important, that actually to know sort of what the genesis and foundation of some of this is. But, we're living at a time when fascism is getting bolted into place in lots of different places, including in this country. And for, George Bush to go after a 24-year-old art student was one thing, or to go after a couple queer artists, Jesse Helms to go after some queer artists. The artists that are on the chopping block now are the play Hamilton, the most widely respected play on around Saturday Night Live, and people that are acting, I forget the guy who's, I can't think of the name right now, but, Alec Baldwin, Meryl Streep, multiple Oscar award winning, the level of the attack and Colin Kaepernick, the Super Bowl playing quarterback who, can't get a job now, because frankly, Trump and those people. And so what we, and I'm assuming broadly speaking, we're on the same side of the barricades, at least within culture, are up against a consolidating fascism. And I recognize that some of you who are thinking about funding and risk, part of the risk is the stuff that we're doing Miguel's upholding revolutionaries. I've burned flags on the steps of the Capitol. I'm a revolutionary. You're going into prisons and working with people that are locked down because of the color of their skin, and you're saying these are actual human beings and they need to be treated as human beings. And I don't know all of what you think politically, but that is on the outside. At a time when they're locking up 2.2 million people, 1.1 of which are black or brown, these are potentially dangerous ideas. I think these dangerous ideas need to be operative in society, which is why this kind of work needs to get the funding. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't recognize that there's a different, higher level culture war that's going on right now, that both is making it challenging to fund this kind of work, but we have to actually go to the people that say that this is the kind of work that really needs funding now.
Can I just add to that real quick? That I just want to, Hiram's work, those photographs with the young lords, those don't exist in any public archive. They're not in any museum collection, and there is definitely an interest in that work now, but there hasn't been necessarily in the past to the same degree. And so it was important for us to do that project in a way that was very public and very visible, but also in a way that would teach that history to an audience that never learned it in school, like me, as well, never learned any of that history in school. And so it became an alternative way to teach that history forward. While that project was up last summer, and just as an example of how people actually can be incredibly proactive to create real change. That last summer was the Summer of Revolution in Puerto Rico in the streets of San Juan, when 500,000 people marched to demand the resignation of a corrupt governor, and Ricky Rosselló eventually resigned because of the pressure of the people. And the people rebelled and responded to not only his alone, but to a whole government's inefficiency and abuse and how they handled things after the hurricane and how that was exposed, right? We're going through that very same process now in Puerto Rico again after the earthquakes and the expose of supplies that were never distributed and could have been to people in need, right? And another corrupt government that's an interim government in charge of the same party. So in Puerto Rico, there was an example, there was a model that was incredibly hopeful. I mean, it made us like want to cry. We were doing these tours because it was happening in real time. We couldn't be there, but we could be here talking about the young lords and making connections. I swear to God, like we cried on public tours about this history during the summer because it was alive, it was real, and we could see an actual change happen, right? So I want you to just imagine that, right? We're 3.5 million people in Puerto Rico on that island, right? And by conservative estimates, the largest march had about 500,000 people in it, right? Probably more. And that's what sort of like turned the corner, and that's what forced the resignation of the government. So imagine even close to that proportion of people in the streets, right, rebelling against a corrupt government, right? Imagine we lived in a place like that, right? You know, but
if only we could find a corrupt government,
right? Exactly. But I mean, as a small model, this was a really powerful example, and I want to lift that example up, but also lift up artists in Puerto Rico who are making work with no resources right now, where institutions are unstable. They are literally physically unstable because of the earthquake that has damaged some of our most important museums, but the funding isn't there either. And there are artists making some of the most important work of their lives in this moment with no resources and no funding. And there's an amazing generation of artists on the island that I also sort of just want to lift up in these moments, because it's such a critical time, both there and here. And our futures are absolutely intertwined and connected to one another.
Lisa and Charles, I want to make sure that you guys get to tell us about your work coming up.
Sure. Thank you. I'm really focused right now on documentation, on documenting my work. The Peculiar Patriot it is so impactful, not only to audiences who are not incarcerated, but to incarcerated audiences. And I recently, last January 8th, I just came back from Angola, where I performed The Peculiar Patriot at Angola Penitentiary, which is a maximum security prison for men in Louisiana. And it's called Angola because it's actually on an actual plantation. It's not a metaphor. It was a plantation. It was called Angola, named after the slaves who were from Angola. And so, fast forward to now, where you have the slave economy that has morphed into the prison economy. We still have, slaves a la inmates who are on this plantation. And so I brought my play, The Peculiar Patriot, into this space. And, I've done the play, many different times in different carceral spaces, and never had a problem. And I performed in front of 700 men in a chapel, and they allowed me to document the day before, film it, and the day of, and they have their own television station. Angola has their own television station, so they were able to live stream my performance to the entire prison. So the 700 men who were not in the chapel, if they were throughout the whole plantation, they could actually watch it from their housing area. And there was a point in the play where my character says, black love is kryptonite for white supremacy, and she throws her hand up in the air, her fist up in the air, and the men in the audience, they were like, with me the whole time, and they threw their fist in the air like, yeah. And so I went to go and change my, finish that scene, and I heard some ruckus, but I wasn't quite sure what was happening. And so, I go backstage to go do my next scene, change my little Ziploc bag to come back out, because it takes place on the visiting room floor of a women's facility. That's the set. And when I came backstage, there was a correctional officer and the man who brought me in and said, we have to stop the show. There's been an emergency in the chapel. And I said, oh, it was the content, because it was like really politically charged. And I was halfway through. And so he goes back out, and he tells the men who are in the chapel that something came up. There's an emergency, and they were like, "Oh, wow, no, we know what's going on. Let her finish the show," because they were having a great time. And so I heard this unrest in the chapel. And so I decided to come out to take my curtain call. I said, I've got to take my curtain call. I've got to bow, and greet the people, even though the play is not finished. They cut it off midway through because it just raised too many hairs on the back of, I'm in Klan territory. I am in Klan territory on a plantation. That did not escape me. And here I am, the child of Harriet, talking about black love is kryptonite for white supremacy. So it created this, something swirled up and shut it down. So I come out and, my normal curtain call is, thank you. And I just came out and I threw my fist in the air and all 700 men jumped up and they gave me a standing ovation and they put their fist in the air and they just started chanting, Lisa, Lisa, Lisa. And so, of course, the COs, they went crazy and they were like, sit down, can't be line up, and there was this whole big thing. And so, I'm making a documentary. And so, of how the peculiar patriot shut Angola down and started a revolution with the men, and the story is still unfolding because they've been reaching out to me on Instagram with their contraband cell phones about how much the show impacted them. They're contacting their wives, and their wives are reaching out to me on Facebook and doing 3-way calls so they can tell me the impact. So the story is still unfolding. So I am looking for funding to do this documentary because we through the grant from Art for Justice, we were able to take a film crew and film this whole journey. So that's what's happening. Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing that. Yes. Sounds amazing. I love how you just your level of description brought me into the room. So really wonderful. And then also I just want to echo the importance of documentation and archiving as well. I mean, BAD turned 21 in December now. We celebrate 20th year. And we have all this stuff and we're like, what the hell do we do with it? Because, and you think 20 years, like it was like, whatever, little tapes and VHSs and all that. I mean, the Hemispheric Institute is helping a little bit where they archive some of Arthur's work. So in April, we're doing an event, so folks will hear about it. But I guess for BAD, in case, I assumed everybody know what BAD is, but just in case you don't, we're Space in the Bronx. We have been there for 21 years. We are a space that presents works that are empowering to women, people of color, and the LGBTQ community. We've braided them together through a series of festivals and events through all of these years, and we consider holding space when some of the, people get our mission now, they understand it. There was a time when they would look at us and say, that sounds like a social justice mission. That's not an arts mission. And we're like, they're not separate, But so I think the next phase, one of the things that we're working on at BAD is something called the Queer Arts Exchange. So I don't know if what they have up there. Okay, is it going to come up? Okay, there we go. And the Queer Arts Exchange is, we've been hyper-local, and BAD has been very happy and very powerful, and we want to continue being hyper-local, serving the Bronx, serving New York City. That to us is a value, and it's really important. And but also because of our profile that has been, we also have a national profile that we very often get requests from artists who are queer, trans, artists of color. They want to come to New York. They want to present something. So we have done it, and we've done it the Maverick way. Sometimes Trinity College is bringing somebody in, and they come to BAD and they'll do something. But we want to make it more intentional. So the Queer Arts Exchange, on the one level, it's an individual artist residency program for queer, trans artists of color, where they will come to BAD and work on work and develop it. It's not only for local artists, but also looking at national and international artists. And I can hit another slide. I forget what's there. Okay. So, this is just an example of one artist. It says from Colombia now. She lives in Mexico City, La Fulminante. These are artists that are creating edgy work. These are artists that are not. Okay, and I guess that's the only other slide that's there. We were limited, and I sent 15, and they did what they needed to do. And I was going to say, just click through them. Just click. No, but anyway, that's fine. There's more if you want to see. But these are artists that are working in different parts of the country. Yosimar Reyes, people may know him. He's an undocumented artist that does poetry and theater. And so these artists, we have developed relationships with them. So we're looking to formalize that. But as I was talking about how important it is to not only say, come, you got space, here's like, come, here's some money, here's this, what other resources do you need? So we're looking to up the ante on that. And so again, so that's one arm of it. The second arm is like, we're not alone doing this in New York City. Maybe we may be a little unique in how we're doing it, but we're not alone. So now there's a network that we're developing that's part of the Queer Arts Exchange. And that's just a working title because we got to get the people together to figure out what we're going to call ourselves. But now we're developing a network. And so right now the initial partners are the Esperanza Center in San Antonio, Makla in San Jose. We're inviting About Face in Chicago. And the Theater Offensive in Boston. And we've talked to Devi Peacock at the Peacock Rebellion in Oakland. So right now, that's the seed. And so right now we've just got a commitment for some money to bring these folks together to begin hashing out what this network could be and how to discover all the other spaces that are welcoming or inviting or seeking or value the work of queer trans artists of color, emerging queer trans artists of color. And then a third level would be like developing this network, but also a network of artists and maybe having convenings so that this work can grow in community and develop on a national level. So that is kind of the next one of the projects that BAD is taking on or leading at this point.
And I guess, as a grant maker on this panel, I would be remiss in not encouraging more in the room to think about the ways that you do support individual artists or organizations that support individual artists, but more importantly, that we start thinking more expansively about what art is, about what art practice is. It is their job. It is your job. It is what you manifest in it, and how we can actually be supportive of it. We at Creative Capital always start with conversations with our artists. It starts and that's where it ends. And ultimately, some changes that we have made, we have an annual application round now, because talking about supporting more of the social justice type work, there's an urgency about it, right? So even though our mandate is to work very long term, how do we make our support more accessible and more readily available? So we have now moved to an annual award cycle, and it was in response to how the artists said they needed to do. And the second, by the way, it's now annually open every February for all of the artists in the room, every February. And secondly, we've also moved to a more multidisciplinary approach. So that this idea of being much more expansive in the way that we ourselves accept projects and what you consider, the art of the theme of the work, but also understanding that artists are working so much more multidisciplinary in the way that they approach the work. So not having to fit within a bucket for you to be a thing. And we've seen great, response to this approach, and are hoping that more support will become available in that context.
So I wanted to open this up for questions. I've gotten some questions here, and I wanted to be, I wanted to explicitly acknowledge the point that you'd made, Dred. When we decided to use this framing device of the culture wars, we want to be explicit that as progress emerges and as what was once edgy becomes increasingly mainstream, regress evolves also, and you're talking about the extent to which we're seeing huge investments being made by people in our government who don't support the arts, who believe that the arts are a waste of money. We're seeing huge investments in harm that are harming our communities. And so with that said, we're in a moment now where we've got a federal election coming up, but there's almost always an election at some point on some scale. And we are really quite passionate about the fact that advocacy is something we should all be engaged in always. And I wanted to talk about the opportunity. I got a question about the opportunity for artists to engage in deliberate, overt advocacy for support to the arts and also support for the communities of which you're a part and that you support. Can you talk about that at all?
What was the question again?
Basically, how can you get supported to be an advocate? To what extent do you feel that you are an advocate in your work, and do you feel supported as an advocate? How would you like to be better supported as an advocate for the arts and for the communities that you're engaged in or you're part of?
Checks.
with a numeral other than 0 before the decimal point, several zeros between that and the decimal point. Yeah, checks. But also, I mean, I think it's like mostly the way I support the communities that I care about is through the art. That's mostly, and I think that's important. So if you support artists, that we don't need to become political advocates. And then the other thing is, the traditions that we kind of come out of are people that actually weren't trying to, work with super PACs, lobby Congress or whatever. I mean, I think, America and capitalism has been a disaster for humanity. I'm actually pointing towards big questions and that are confronting humanity and not trying to see fundamentally how can we get more funding for the art. I don't want to be turned into the person that can go sit down with some, government official in, Albany and say, look, you should give us more. That I do think they should. And I'm willing to have that conversation. But I think the main thing is, it's like, you just heard that there was this really beautiful play that was being produced in a prison where people are locked down, where 75% of the people who go to that prison are going to die in prison. And she was deeply connecting with them and talking about the harm that white supremacy does and the importance of self-love of black people. And where the prison was like, you can't do that. That's the kind of work that needs to be supported and expanded. We need to change a situation where all these people are locked down. That's, we don't, I'm not saying that you should not be an advocate and talking for more money, but we need you doing work like that. I need to be, doing slave rebellions and putting visions of armed black and indigenous peoples sort of being liberating armies in metropolitan areas in the United States and connecting that past to the present, not trying to figure out how can we just get a little bit more money to some artists. I will argue for that. I can tell why it's I can have conversations on the financial and economic level and how artists are damn good investments if you want to revitalize neighborhoods or whatever. But, the thing is, you should fund us making this art. I mean, you people who are more in the advocacy space, please go advocate so that we can have more money to do this art. But you don't need to turn us into you.
Yeah, I agree. That's well said. But I would say that we also end up doing that work all the time, like in the various spaces that we're in. And, we each have platforms in those spaces, sometimes in rooms like this, sometimes in rooms that are smaller. But that is, I think, a call that we respond to probably because social responsibility and social justice is also part of like the spaces we come from, the communities we come from, the people that have inspired us, et cetera. And it's the kind of work that we're making. But not everybody has those same sort of like skills or abilities or interests. And I think that it is a kind of like another expectation that it can be shared. Right, with everybody in the room, obviously. But I will say also that trust us, trust artists. And I want to thank the foundations that are here that have trusted us and supported us. It's made all the difference in my life. And that is huge. And I want to encourage everyone to trust artists in what they're doing if you think that they're making important work.
But I do just want to say, and I think that, putting images of the young lords back into the community where the young lords came from, where the young lords at one point, took over part of a hospital. They did takeovers of things to actually make real demands for change, and it wasn't advocacy or lobbying. And that's what that's what I'm not opposed to talking to various officials. I will sit down and talk with any of you about why we need more money, or if you want to go down to Albany, I will do that. But my point is, you should learn from this and this. This is what's really needed. That's why we need the money, not for the arts in the abstract, but actually connecting to a time when people actually realized that there was a real battle for the future and that the people who were most oppressed and exploited actually had a lot to say about how we got free.
And they weren't social practice artists. You know? they were activists, right? And so I had great pride and felt very privileged to be able to sort of host and facilitate a project about their history and to work with some of the people who were involved in shaping it from the beginning. But really my role in this, and this is also an important point, is that my role in that project as an artist was as a facilitator and organizer. That is the primary role that I played. And that's a really different role. That I wasn't making objects. I was putting those billboards up. I was getting the permissions and the permits and the leases and negotiating all that, being the advocate, being the politician in the community, being everything I needed to be to get that done. And it was a lot of work that it was behind the scenes, but we made it happen. And then it turned into a other project. But what else did we do? We got some of the original Young Lords that took over Lincoln Hospital and that created the first acupuncture detox programs at Lincoln in the early 70s, which if you don't know about, that like every municipal hospital in the city has an acupuncture detox program because of the Young Lords and the Panthers and other black and brown liberation organizations that organized at that time for holistic health, for approaches to dealing with addiction and trauma that was experimental at the time, right? And some of those people are still doing that work. People like Walter Bosque. Walter Bosque is in East Harlem. And so every month with that project, we hosted a free acupuncture and holistic health space for our community, right? That was not, we promoted it, but it wasn't like broadcast as a social practice project, you know, online for broad audiences. Everybody was invited, but it was mainly for our community to participate in. And we had 100 people who showed up almost every week at those spaces, right? That for me was also part of the art, right? I don't frame it that way as the social practice because I'm averse to a lot of the terms, but it's about the responsibility of artists in communities, right? At the same time, it's about our collective responsibilities towards social justice and sort of mental health and wellness, et cetera. But I don't think of those as like, you know, I think that how we label that should be very flexible and that the work can look like a lot of different things. And I'm glad that you introduced so many kind of new models for thinking and for acting. And I'm encouraged to see artists sort of acting and thinking in non-traditional ways, right? In ways that do not always make sense in a gallery or a museum, but make sense in community.
And let me ask you, I mean, my framing for that question was very oriented around a very traditional construct of what advocacy is. And this is oftentimes the case. And what I heard was really interesting because it really spoke to the creation of your work itself being what was most important. I wanted to ask you if you could give me some critiques of some of what you get handed to you by people who are well-intended but don't necessarily understand what it is to be an artist 24/7, what it is to be somebody who is doing this kind of work 24/7. You know, you're oftentimes being asked either A, to predict metrics of social change that aren't necessarily on you, or some sort of return on investment. What kinds of things are you wrestling with by people who are sincerely trying to help you that would help us to be more supportive in the future?
Well, I mean, those two things that you laid out are important. Also, the number of people affected, butts in seats or wherever. No, I mean, but also even more, given that artists often don't have the infrastructure of organizations, asking for the level of reporting that organizations do just means that it's actually an extra burden on artists. And it's like, even if it only takes, say, a day and a half to pull together the financial data and some of the metrics and write the report, that's a day and a half that's sort of unaccounted for in the funding structure, and it's beyond that stressful. I mean, and whereas I suspect that most of sort of the EDs that are out here or wherever, and I do most of my work actually is in galleries and museums. I do make objects, but I don't exclusively do that, and most of the work that needs more funding is bigger projects that actually should not be forced into that. And they're the kind of work that's on this stage, including with BAD, I mean, that work needs support. It is never, ever, ever going to sell like Hollywood. It's not going to. And so unless we really think, well, all we want is Hollywood or the equivalent in the fine arts, if that's what you want, then that's one way our funding should go. If you don't want that, if you actually see a value for stuff that will, always need some input of funding, including to the individual artist and not just the physical plant. I mean, to fund, like, say, the Brooklyn Academy of Music or the Museum of Modern Art, those are fine places to put a lot of money. But then if the artists don't get the same sort of funding, and I don't mean necessarily the millions and hundreds of millions they get, but more if they don't get funding with the understanding of, yes, there's general operating expenses and stuff, then you actually won't have sort of a model where this creativity and daring and risk can really happen. And so the predictive, but also the you should strive, you should be like the rest of the, you should strive to be like, say Ai Weiwei, who's an artist I really like a lot. But no, I really like, I think his best work is really challenging. But, everybody's not going to be him, and certainly every artist should not try and be Jeff Koons. That would be a terrible thing to be. But, it's like, but the logic of some of the funding structure is that we're going to give you a little seed money, and then you're going to stand on your own. Or that you're going to set up a 501c3 and you're going to get funding like this. And that I don't want to do that either. So
I think one of the things I do want to say, because I think you were talking about also the demands that are put on us. So in terms of reporting, you were talking about, and part of me is like, I don't know the answer to that, right? I don't know the answer because, we're sitting in a room with people, and one of my experiences, particularly working with Mosaic, is really understanding the intimacy of the process, right? And that a lot of the folks in this room, in a way, are advocates for us, right? In a way, they are the advocates, and then they have to present all this data to other people, right? That are really the ones giving the money, and that so I don't know. Less reporting. So I think that's just something that how do we address that? Because I think the beauty when we talked earlier of the NIFA grants, you get a little bit of money and they're like, go do your thing, and maybe you write something and you do some. It isn't like a whole bunch of stipulations to it, but I think it is this tension, and the bigger the more money you get, the more I think responsibility that comes with it. So I think it's a question. That's.
Can we also urge? Yeah. The decision makers to start thinking more broadly about it. This idea of trust, right? Let's trust the artists with their work and not burden them with making the case. That's our job. And ultimately also, a lot of this data I find kind of leads to this kind of groupthink, right? And we're all supporting similar things in the similar ways. And ultimately, the more we do our own thinking about where we stand and what we want to support and how we want to support it and release the artists from some of those burdens, the better, right? And I'm not suggesting that everybody in this room is a decision maker within the organization, but the more we can encourage those types of conversations. Who we're inviting in, who is advising us, who we're inviting in our case, as evaluators, it makes a huge difference in what the outcome is and what artists are selected. I'm proud in the inroads we've made in becoming a much more inclusive organization, supporting a much more diverse, kind of representation of the true voices of this country, but also across the country. Are we sure that we are focusing and providing support where there is a real need? Outside of the typical cultural hubs, right, where we mostly navigate, or where the concentration of the infrastructure is in support. And I do hope that hearing from these artists is encouraging us to think a little bit more broadly, more expansively in the way that we organize ourselves in support of. Sorry, that's my soapbox. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think we were mentioning the Young Lords, but one of the first kind of trust votes of confidence for Embad's history in the beginning. One of the first grants was through Edith Morales when she was doing the Union Square Awards. And it was like one of the first time that somebody just said, I understand what you guys are doing, and gave us $25,000. And that was one of my weeping moments when I got off the phone with her. I'm sitting in this office in a warehouse that didn't have heat, and it was cold, and Arthur was rehearsing, and I put my head down on the desk and I cried, and I went to Arthur. I said, somebody just gave us $25,000. And for us, that was a lot of money. But it was about, she talked about that. She talked about, it's about how do we trust you? I have to convince somebody to trust you with this money.
That's the difference of an advocate. One advocate within an organization can make all the difference. I just want to add to that on a smaller scale of what everybody can also do, and that what often happens is that even in smaller venues like these kinds of venues, panel discussions, et cetera, like pay the artists, pay the artists generously. We all know like who the foundations are that pay well and that don't pay well. Honestly, because we do a lot of things. and so we're it's 3:00 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in the middle of the day, and who the people who don't have full-time jobs here are? The artists. Who make the least amount of money up here? The artists. So that just keep that in mind when you're organizing and working with artists too, that this is the day for us. In spite of the work we did this morning that we'll do tonight, right? And it's a different kind of work, and that's not always, I think, factored in. We understand we have this is the amount we pay for panels, right? This is the amount we pay for speakers. And I would urge everybody to sort of rethink and reconsider, what best practices look like in those spaces, and talk to each other and find out, where the most generous practices are and how they actually really make a difference. Because for us, they make a huge difference. And so I'm glad I got to mention that here. But honestly, it's a simple thing that we talk about we deal with or talk about every day.
Yeah, I mean, we are the plankton of the art world. We are. Without us, y'all don't exist. Those of you that are social justice people, fine, different. But, but it is like without the artists, the art world doesn't exist. And I think the thing of keep in mind what art, if you don't believe in a world where artists work day gigs all the time, then you guys have some of the ability to change that. And what Miguel said earlier, who can afford to take residencies? I only do residencies if it pays well enough for me to do it at this point. Otherwise, I don't do them. But one residency, which was on the scale of residencies, was well funded. And on the exit interview, I said, none of your senior staff would or could afford to take this residency. And it paid well. It was one of the best paid residencies that I had. But I said, none of your senior staff would afford to take this because it doesn't actually really pay for rent, studio rent, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It was better than other options that I had at the time. But it was something and so if you don't think it's good enough for your senior staff, why do you think it's good enough for artists?
And I also just wanted to reflect for a moment. Oh, thank you. I also wanted to reflect for a moment about something that you've all touched upon, but Lisa, you specifically really created this really like energized moment for all of us when you were talking about a moment that was created by your art, and you were talking about the need to document it. And so one of the things that I've heard you all say that is particularly difficult is the need to report out, like in terms of just, the time it takes, et cetera. But, what was really compelling about that was you talked about a thing you did with your art, a thing that was ephemeral and a thing that happened in real time, and that was the power of art. And while we're in the process of asking for people to give us metrics, we just so seldom actually create opportunities for artists to document that kind of work, that's one of the least sexy things to finance. But it was the moment that raised all of the hairs on the backs of our necks, that was so important. And so I just wanted to as we move towards closing, I just wanted to point out how important that was and to thank you for making that point far better than I could have.
No, thank you. Yeah, it was interesting because I got funding to perform the play at Angola, and then it was suggested that I document it. And it was actually the funder, this is the same funder who told me that I wasn't paying myself enough, who said, because I said I wanted to film it, so I was thinking how I could take from my fee and, give this person less a fee. I'm scraping, and she says, well, we have some discretionary funds, and just to give me that freedom and to say, we'll pay for the filming, like extra, on top of what we're already giving you to perform. Again, so it's that level of awareness and support. And this is just one particular funder who gets artists in a really specific way, and whenever I ask for money, they give me more than what I asked for. Like that is astounding. That is affirming.
But that's also because this artist is willing to do way more with way too little. And artists almost always do that. We'll do a $150,000 project on $100,000. We'll make it work and realize we're really efficient here. And yet we shouldn't have to be, because what she was saying is, well, okay, I'll eat ramen noodles so I can get this documented.
Right.
Artists shouldn't be eating ramen noodles. I mean, we should, but no. I mean, I do think, well, half the world tries to survive on less than $2 a day. So it's like, okay, if you got ramen noodles and not nothing, that's okay. But nonetheless, artists shouldn't be having to take out of our fees to do stuff. And you all know that when we propose a project, the artist is, everything is bare bones, and we don't really have enough to do the way that it should be done. Right. So, look at our budget and double it and give us that.
Yeah, I'd like to live in a world where artists are valued, right? I mean, that's my big dream. Like, can we get there to a place where you are working from a place of abundance versus scarcity? This idea of how do we get there? How do we get the general population to value the work that you do and understand that you are navigating conversations that we wouldn't be able to do on our own, and creating a space to do so also in a way that it navigates towards change. Yeah. So, sorry. But I feel like that's the world I want to live in, and that's what we should all aspire to, I think.
Great. I want to just make sure those were fantastic closing remarks, so I don't want to mess up those with anything coming out of my mouth. I just want to say the reason we do all this is to facilitate our learning, and it was a real privilege to get to learn from all of you today. I just want to say thank you very much for taking this time to talk to us, and I want to give you a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sherilyn, do you have closing remarks?
Just a few thank yous. Just a few. So a second thank you to all of our panelists and to you, Eddie, for sharing all of your knowledge. I don't know if this is on, but
No, I don't. No, it's definitely not on.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Always speak in the microphone.
Oh, yes, you're right.
No.
That's true.
Facebook can't hear you.
Yeah, I know, but I already went for this one. All right. So again, thank you. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing everything. Just echoing all of the thank yous that were just made. And I also want to thank the New York-based Support for Individual Artists Committee members who were a really big part of this planning process. New York GIA, and specifically Cheryl Anhava, who couldn't be here today. She has been instrumental in this planning process with myself and some others. So when you see her, make sure to say, "We loved the event. Thank you so much." Just so she knows that, because I know she really wanted to be here. Grantmakers in the Arts and Philanthropy New York for hosting us. So thank you all for coming. And please join us at Public House to continue the conversation. We're having happy hour, so please do come. And thank you.